So you've probably talked a lot about energy. My own research actually is a bit more about climate and other environmental issues than energy specifically. But I don't need to tell you probably that when you work on climate policy, energy becomes very important. And when you work on energy policy, climate becomes very important. So there's obviously a big overlap, synergies, or also conflicts, depending on what kind of energy we talk about. So what I'd like to do is my slides and my presentation is a bit more about climate, but I really hope that we can discuss and link everything to climate, to energy, and compare maybe EU climate diplomacy to EU energy diplomacy, because it's often mentioned in one sentence, or climate diplomacy is mentioned as a good example or role model for energy diplomacy, but I don't think it's that straightforward. There are some differences, and so I would suggest that we jointly also discuss a bit what these differences are and where the synergies lie. But let's start. I'd like to start with a question. And that's traveling back in time. I know we have a different US president now, but we did have a US president who did not like the Paris Agreement and who was not very ambitious on climate policy. So imagine we're back in 2017 when this is a photo from the Rose Garden speech, when in June 2017, President Trump announced that the United States were going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. As you all know, eventually that could only happen a few days before the elections that then eventually lost. But nonetheless, imagine we're in 17 and you're an EU diplomat. What kind of strategy would you have developed? How do you think did the EU react to President Trump's announcement of the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement? What can the EU do in such a case? Do you have any idea, or do you know what the EU did maybe? Anyone? So I can't see everyone because of the presenters mode, so just maybe take the floor and say something. No one? Well, the EU didn't do much, but it did say something. No one, any idea? So basically it was a very difficult case in terms of climate diplomacy, because the United States is, as you all know, a very powerful country. We don't have much leverage. We can't just use, I don't know, development cooperation or trade agreements to somehow put conditionality in the wording or somehow pressure them into a certain behavior. So that was actually a very tough nut to crack. And well, hoping for the elections was one, but another strategy that the EU did, or what we can really see, is that the EU, they condemned the US. So publicly in speeches, well, condemned is probably hard work, but they said that they did not agree with the position. The European Parliament was a bit more vocal and direct in its criticism than, for example, the European Council, but all of the EU institutions reacted and voiced that they don't agree with that decision, and also pursued its ambitious policy, or did not change its own policy. It rather took it as a reason to rally the troops domestically in the EU, and some politicians at least used it as a reason to become even more ambitious, to say we need to compensate, we really need to hold the fort, we need to be or remain committed to the Paris Agreement goals. So this is something that that was a big worry that not just the EU, but a number of other observers had as well, that this announcement would have a domino effect, that other countries would also say, oh, the US is withdrawing, this is a big economic factor for us, or a big ideological factor. We are also going to withdraw, or we are reducing our level of ambition. So that was the second concern that the EU, I think, tried to really to avoid that any other country would jump on the bandwagon. So those are two reactions that we see either explicitly or implicitly from the EU side. But as I said, but it was probably the worst case from a external policy or diplomacy point of view, in the sense that the US is such a powerful player. We don't have much or any leverage over them. So this is to illustrate how difficult climate diplomacy, and I guess energy is probably very similar. Climate diplomacy can be, in a sense, when you take it a bit broader than the negotiations themselves. So when we look at external climate policy. And what I put here is just a brief reminder. I guess you all know about the different kinds of external policies that we can use, the different tools that we can use. But I thought just to refresh our minds, to structure the discussion a bit, I'll put it up here. And what you can differentiate, you can also do it a bit more fine-grained. But in general, we have two groups. We have one which is about creating incentives or disincentives for certain behaviors. And that's the area in which we probably don't have anything that we can use with the United States. So this would be trade and investment agreements, where the European Union includes sustainability chapters, includes the commitment to be a party to the Paris Agreement, and all those kinds of things. It also includes product regulation, so energy efficiency standards that we allow or don't allow, or set for the EU level. They also apply to any product produced anywhere, as long when it's sold on the EU market. So often you actually have a logic that some producers change their production or change their product design for not just the EU market, but also external markets. So through actually domestic regulation, often the EU, since it's such a large and attractive market, has an effect beyond its borders. Then what we've seen very much being, or very much increasingly being used in as a tool for climate policy, is capacity building and development cooperation. So one policy on which I conduct some research is emissions trading systems, or greenhouse gas emissions trading, where the EU certainly used capacity building projects with China, Kazakhstan, South Korea, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some countries, to help and enable them to adopt a similar policy to the EU's experiment, which, you know, as you all probably know, was adopted in 2003 and started in 2005. So helping through technical expertise, but also policy design and sharing lessons of what went well, but also what did not go well. So kind of mistakes to avoid. And help other countries in that regard. And then, of course, development cooperation plays a big role. Mainstreaming climate into development cooperation has been on the EU agenda for quite some time. And so we have the commitment of, well, for the 2020 budget, it was 20% of the budget to be dedicated or related to climate expenditures. And that, of course, also applied to development cooperation. And now with the new multi-annual financial framework, it will become even more. So this is a bit the incentives and disincentives range of tools that, that the EU generally tends to use. Then the less forceful group of tools is then the more diplomatic ones. So diplomatic outreach, talking to countries, trying to persuade or convince them of engaging in more ambitious climate policy, or adopting certain kinds of policies and the like. And what we see very much with some key countries in particular, like China, but also many others, is that policy dialogues have been around for quite some time to discuss technical matters. So often they're rather at a technical level, not necessarily at a high level, but there are also some high level dialogues. And of course, the negotiations, the UNFCCC would be the prime negotiation forum for trying to conclude international agreement. So this is probably more of a background or a reminder of all the different tools that the EU would have at its disposal. But, and now I have a next question and I'm scared to ask it because probably no one will answer, but it depends very much on the country. So for what kind of countries do you think is which of the external policies tools best suited? What would you use for what kind of country?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. And I think that, yeah, for the kind of, depending of course by the kind of tool that you're going to use. For example, if you're a country that has both the private sector and other parts of their trade agreements very strong tightly with the EU, or even just with one single European country, these external tools work best. So I think it's very much dependent on the previous linkages between that country and either the whole European Union area or single countries themselves. Especially I can imagine for energy policy where they're dependent so much on innovation and product development, so they have to be coordinated also in their policy developments.
Yeah, and also I don't know whether that's what you meant, but if there's no interdependence, if there's no link through supply chains, through, in the case of energy, maybe even physical infrastructure pipelines, then there is some of these policy tools don't work. You can't use a trade link or trade as a tool if there's no trade link. So indeed, interdependence is the requirement for some of them to actually work. And I guess that probably for energy might make a big difference and play a big role and be a difference between energy and climate, that we actually really have physical interdependence with some countries through pipelines, and the EU might be weaker also in some areas because we're dependent on imports from some countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, sorry to follow up. I hope there's time, but I was also wondering, because here we're talking about climate policy, and we're focusing, of course, because we're talking about energy, on climate change mitigation. But then, for example, if we think about climate change adaptation, that is something very localized, and maybe the interest and the even capacity that the EU can build in another country is not the same. So having even a capacity building support from the EU in a country in Southern Asia where floodings or other natural disasters are completely different handled than here in Europe. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting distinguish that you're doing between, say, not just between energy and climate, but also between climate change mitigation, adaptation, because the interlinkages for adaptation, they're very, very different from the same kind of networks that you can build if you want to develop strategy for climate change mitigation. I hope it made sense, my flow of thoughts.
No, absolutely. I hadn't really thought about adaptation too much when I talked about it. I had much more mitigation in my mind. But indeed, adaptation, maybe the EU's interest is different as well. Because, well, it's of course the altruistic interest in helping countries, but in terms of mitigating or the overall goals of the Paris Agreement, it might not be as high, or the motivation might be a bit different. Indeed, and we might not force a country to do adaptation, but we might want to try to force them to do mitigation. Yeah, but another thing that you mentioned, which is also important, is a certain degree of willingness. So, for example, these capacity building projects that I mentioned, they only work if there's the willingness and the receptiveness in the countries that most of the times, or I think in all cases, had already taken the decision to adopt an emissions trading system. And then could the EU go in and help them develop it? But through that tool, the EU did not change their basic interest in, or did not influence the decision to actually adopt such a policy. It could rather build on the decision to adopt the policy and then help. So it's at a different stage of the policy cycle in a way. While some of the maybe a bit more forceful ones, let's say in a trade link or the threat to withdraw some kind of trade flow might actually really change the interests or might increase the willingness of a country to adopt a certain kind of policy. And then maybe capacity building could build on and further strengthen that development. Yeah, indeed. So the willingness or the principled interest in engaging in climate mitigation policy in some countries is also a condition. Otherwise, some of the tools don't work. Yeah. Anyone else? Or Valeria, do you have a follow-up? No? Good. So I have one slide which goes even broader than climate, but just to tell you what the EU does. So this is a copy paste from a book that together with two colleagues I co-edited 3-4 years ago. And what we did there is we asked people to write chapters about different tools. So you can see the different chapters in the left column. And we also, so there was different regions, different policy areas, and different tools. And then what we did there was we differentiated 3 groups of tools, but capacity building could also be, so capacity building and manipulating utility calculations could be one, and that would then be the incentives and disincentives that I had in my previous table. And so what we did then in the end, once everyone had written their chapter, is we asked them to rate how intensively the EU uses those different tools in the respective area. And what you can see very clearly is that the probably more difficult tools of really engaging in dialogue, negotiation, and persuasion is used more frequently, or up until now, was used more frequently and more intensively than these more forceful tools. Certainly, what we called manipulating utility calculations was really using threats of trade, kind of using market access, trade agreements, and all these things that could potentially have quite severe economic impacts on certain countries. So there we found actually that that's not used up to the level as other use of other tools. And I found that quite interesting, and I certainly find it quite interesting in light of the current debate, because what I have the impression that we're moving, or that the debate is moving towards the argument for more forceful incentive-based tools. And I actually already asked whether you talked about the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the Green Deal, and you seem to have talked about it already a bit. So, well, we'll see. If you have questions about it, we can discuss it further. But that is quite a forceful tool. It's really using access to the EU market, not just towards one country, but towards potentially a large set of countries or the entire world. And yeah, trying to force them to engage in a certain climate action. And so, well, as we all know, the proposal will only be published in summer this year. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know We don't know for what area it will be applied. But nonetheless, it's really going more into the right hand side of this table, and that seems to be something that that the EU has the intention to use more, or maybe trying to compensate for sometimes the shortcomings of the dialogues and negotiations. But I don't say that they will or should reduce dialogue and negotiations. I think it's rather meant as a complementary measure to increase the ambition of a number of countries. Good. Are there any questions about that? No? Then this is just a few elements of basically what was already included in this earlier table. So what I'd like to do now is just to go through those different tools or activities that are really directly linked to external policy. So where the primary goal of the policy is actually external change. And for climate, that certainly is the multilateral negotiations, the UNFCCC context, but also very much diplomacy, trade, and development cooperation. And so if we look at multilateral climate agreements, yeah, we do have this big arena in which we had or still have negotiations. We had this big success in Paris. And I put a photo here from Ban Ki-moon and Hollande and many of the other people who were very happy in December 2015 when they actually could conclude the Paris Agreement. But this, of course, was the outcome of a very long process. It was not just the 2 weeks that they spent in Paris, but it was years before that parties intensively negotiated to actually come to this point that everyone could give their consensus to that agreement. And the EU did play quite an important role, as you can imagine, probably. And when we look at the EU's role in those negotiations, it actually has claimed for a long time that it is a leader or wants to be a leader. But not always has it really been credible or been as strong as it has become. You probably have heard about the 2009 Copenhagen negotiations or Conference of the Parties, where, many people thought we were going to conclude an international agreement, but in the end, it did not work out. And what the EU often was accused of, and maybe accused itself of as well, was that it did not necessarily engage so much in outreach and diplomacy to other countries. The EU at the time thought that by adopting its own ambitious domestic or EU level climate policies, it could be an example, it could establish an example, and it would attract followers just by being ambitious. And at the time, that was the 2020 target that you probably have heard of. So reducing EU greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by the year 2020 compared to 1990 levels, and also 20% renewable energy and energy efficiency. So there, this exemplary leadership was thought of as being maybe already good enough to attract some followers. The EU then even had a conditional clause in its target saying that if major other countries also adopt equally ambitious policy, it would increase a 20% target to a 30% target. That never happened. Also, it shows you as a little illustration that setting the example alone probably is not going to attract followers. So this did not entirely work out how the EU had hoped or anticipated it to work. And then also in Copenhagen, the EU was accused of being busy with itself much more than with others. So maybe more negotiating among the EU member states than with the other countries in the UNFCCC context. And so that's why this is often seen as the turning point or one of the wake-up calls for the EU to change its climate diplomacy and to really develop a climate diplomacy strategy, which it then did. So the first reflection papers are from 2011. And that basically very much links to what often is called entrepreneurial leadership. So basically these leadership types that I put on the slide here, they're taken from Wurzel and Liefering. They have a number of articles where they differentiate different leadership types. So one exemplary leadership is setting an example, showing and demonstrating that certain policies are possible. And that is what the EU has done for a long time. Entrepreneurial leadership is about more the activity, diplomatic outreach, really trying to bring different actors together, forging alliances, building coalitions, and really, I guess, the game of active and skillful diplomacy. And that was what up until 2009, certainly, the EU neglected. It probably did not, or certainly not strategically, engage in really listening to other countries, taking their concerns into consideration, trying to maybe also adjust its position to whatever what seems feasible to other countries, trying to enable and help them. So all these kinds of considerations is something that that really came maybe through the shock of Copenhagen. And then cognitive leadership is ideas. So maybe putting new ideas on the table, trying to help the process forward through some compromise proposals and the like. So this is also, I guess, what we see that to some extent the EU moved away from its very rigid, this is what we want, binding targets for all the industrialized countries, figures that we can measure, which all, of course, in an ideal world would lead us to our goal, but for some countries is just not, they will never agree to it due to, sovereignty concerns and the like. So this is the evolution that we saw from between Copenhagen and Paris. And one of the things in which the EU was quite engaged is what they call the High Ambition Coalition. It was something, the EU was not necessarily the initiator. It came from a number of people, certainly the Marshall Islands, and the then negotiator from the Marshall Islands was very much a driving force. But it was a coalition, as the name says, for high ambition for the Paris Agreement. And really looking or taking the concerns of vulnerable countries serious. And in the beginning was very much those countries that don't contribute much to climate change, but suffer a lot. And then it really took on momentum. And I think at one point in Paris, that was probably also one of those steps that took it one step closer to agreement, was when Brazil joined that coalition, broke up the basic group as a bloc. And so really trying to build that coalition was one of the efforts in which the EU certainly engaged very much, and where it took the lessons from Copenhagen very seriously. Just a few photos on how complex the EU is nonetheless. So this is also, the bottom two are from Paris. And does anyone know who Carole Dieschbourg is and why she's next to the then Commissioner for Climate Action? Anyone? She's actually from Luxembourg, so the only country that's not a part of Enter. Maybe that's why no one knows it. So she's from Luxembourg, and she was, I don't know whether she still is, but she was the environment minister from Luxembourg in 2015. And in the EU, we have a rotating presidency in the Council of the EU. So at the time, Luxembourg held the presidency of the Council, and for that reason, the Luxembourgish minister played quite a prominent role in the negotiations. Then after that, I can't remember to whom it went. So then January afterwards, it was someone else again. So, but yes, then, no, I think in December, so the signing was then done by the Dutch environment minister. So nonetheless, although the EU really became much more coherent. For some external people, it might still be quite confusing because there's always more than one person. So here in that case, the commissioner and the country holding the presidency of the council. The photo that I put up in the middle is then a meeting with the Chinese, well, the second in row, so not Xi Jinping, not the president, but Li Qing, I can't remember his name because I said correctly, and who then also needs to shake two and not just one hands in terms of the two presidents of the Commission and the European Council. So that sometimes can be a bit confusing for external countries. But overall, what we really see is that the EU has established a quite complex system of really coordinating its position and speaking with one voice. Don't think we need to go into the details of how the council is structured, but it's quite interesting. Good, so yeah, and sorry, this is already next. So this is for the actual multilateral negotiations, where the EU we really see quite a development in terms of coherence, but also, I guess, realizing how the EU should, or that the EU should listen more to other countries, that outreach really is important, and that exemplary leadership alone is not going to get you where you want to get. Of course, you do have some research, for example, by Sebastian Obertür and Lisanne Kuhn, who say that yes, the EU was probably more, or achieved more of its goals in Paris compared to Copenhagen, but its position or its goals were also a bit less ambitious than they used to be. So of course, you also can achieve more if you're less ambitious, but that probably also was a result of this taking other positions more into account and maybe being more realistic in a way. So it has, of course, always these two sides. If you then look at the broader level of diplomacy, so bilateral diplomacy, declarations, outreach to non-state actors and the like, there actually is quite a lot that the EU really developed over the last about 10 years, more or less. The strategies I mentioned already, that included a toolbox for climate diplomacy. So really trying to think about what kind of tools do the EU delegations need, or do other EU diplomats need for effective outreach. They established a focal point in every EU delegation on the world. So I don't know whether you all know what EU delegations are. They're basically the EU's embassies. They're just not called that way, and they don't serve certain functions, but in terms of that kind of diplomacy, they're the same or very similar to an embassy. And so in every of those delegations, there is a focal point. So if the Commission or the External Action Service headquarters wants to send out an email or whatever other instructions, there's someone to whom they send it. It's very well organized in that sense. And what the EU did is, certainly before Paris, and they're now trying to do it again or emphasize it more, is really using all high-level fora to also talk about climate change. So using G7, using G20, and all these very high-level fora to also bring up that topic. What I put here is just the so yeah, a little figure that I made together with Franziska Petri for some research that we did on EU delegations and then what EU delegations do in terms of climate diplomacy. And it was quite complex drawing that, because, and you probably don't really understand what all these things are. And so this kind of demonstrates how many actors are involved. So the EU delegations are part of the European External Action Service, which has a headquarter in Brussels, and then the delegations on the ground. And together they're the External Action Service. So in the headquarters, you have, now it's, I think, 2 people in charge of climate diplomacy. Since, I think, a year, they have a special or a higher level diplomat on climate diplomacy, which they didn't have before. So he's called Ambassador at large, I think is the title for climate diplomacy. So it became a bit more of a higher level thing, but in the end, it's not many people. It's very few people, certainly compared to DG Klima, which has hundreds of people on climate, not all on international climate, but so the issue specific and technical expertise certainly rests with the Commission and DG Climate Action. And then you have these, well, more diplomacy focused people in the headquarters and then people in the delegations. In the delegations, however, most people don't have climate as their full-time occupation. Most of them have climate as part of their portfolio. Often it actually is with energy together. Sometimes it's other issues. In many low-income countries, it's in the development cooperation section, while in others it's in the political section. So there are different people in different sections depending on the country, but overall, often the capacity is not so high in terms of human resources. And what they then do, and certainly that's part of what they developed then as part of the climate diplomacy strategy, is a number of things. It's there's actually Agora platform is an online platform, and what the Brussels-based institutions did is they developed actually quite many tools. That's part of this toolbox that I mentioned earlier. They put lines to take on there. So really, if a diplomat in a certain country gets a certain request or is accused of something or gets some statement of pertaining to climate change, climate policy, the EU's position, then they actually have a sheet where they can look, this is the EU's position on this topic. Also some country information on the country in which the delegations are based to kind of then again understand the local context, but often the delegations actually provide that information so that the understanding can be increased of that country. And also some narratives. So on certain issues like economic growth and climate, you can develop different narratives. One is that you have a win-win situation. Another one would be that the climate policy is detrimental to economic growth. So certain narratives to enable delegates to do their job and to know what kind of messages or how they should communicate on climate change to their host country. And they organize a number of events. Also, something that's I think some try to use to copy in other policy areas is this climate diplomacy action day, which now is a week, where you would have all different kinds of activities, ranging from ambassadors cycling to work to raise awareness to climate and transportation behavior, to little competitions, expositions, events, conferences, all these kinds of things. So that is a mobilization that's often highlighted as something that people really think is effective. And this is just one slide. Actually, it was a project I was involved in some time ago, developing these narratives, and you probably can't read it at all, but it was narratives on climate science, because some diplomats would actually get a question about climate science, whether climate change is man-made and those kinds of things. So good. That was the diplomacy side. And I don't have much on trade. We already discussed it and maybe or mentioned it, and maybe we can now go to the discussion relatively quickly. So also with Valeria's comments, interdependence, trade and economic relations are quite largely developed. And so the fourth type of leadership that I haven't mentioned yet, I already mentioned cognitive, entrepreneurial, and exemplary. The fourth type that Wurzel and Liefering differentiate is structural leadership, and that really comes into play very much with trade, for example. So, probably not with the US, but with a number of countries, the EU actually is a very attractive market. And if it says, if you want to trade with us, then you do this, this, and this, it probably works, at least to some extent. So, and this, as I mentioned already, we have clauses on the Paris Agreement in the newer trade agreements. And then development cooperation, I also already mentioned. We have quite some mainstreaming. This is another type of structural leadership where we use our structural position in terms of being a donor. Actually, the EU and its member states jointly being the largest donor on the globe, and trying to mainstream climate into all of those projects, which of course doesn't always work, and then there's some critical voices, but generally there is an effort on that. Good. So this was me going through a number of the points of the case of climate change. But what I hope we can do, and I hope now you're a bit warmed up or a bit more active after your lunch, what do you think is the difference or the similarity between external climate policy and external energy policy? Could the EU just copy paste its climate diplomacy strategy to energy, and would it work? Anyone, any idea? Maybe based on all the things that you discussed this morning. No one?
Hi, I just can simply add, it seems to me so far that they have to be very well integrated together. They might be probably two tracks, but these tracks have to be very close to each other, and they have to have like very close interactions.
Indeed, and that's actually the second question, as I could put that up as well. But how would you do that for the pipelines, for example? No, I find that a very difficult issue, because if you're very ambitious in terms of climate policy, then gas even is not the right investment.
Here, Katja, this is the question that I wanted to ask you. So far you did like very extensive research on how does this very complex machine works. But what I was wondering about is like when you were talking about engaging with other countries, non-EU countries, in my view, the big question is what actors are you actually engaging with? And are these only political leadership, which if so, is very limited number of people and views as well, and motivations also. And here your question is very much related to my question that I wanted to bring you. So whether the other actors other than political leadership were and have been involved into this dialogue and creation of this EU policy.
Yeah,
and also the way of so the role of bilateral relations between the EU member countries and non-EU countries as well.
Yeah, so the first point, it depends on the country, of course, but in some countries, the government is not even very receptive to climate policy. So that's what they then try to do. Also for the US case, we didn't in the end talk much about it. But even under Trump, the EU and others could talk to California, could talk to subnational actors, could talk to NGOs, the whole Bloomberg campaign. So that outreach to those kinds of actors and also trying to engage in public diplomacy. So, building public support is certainly part of it. What I am a bit skeptical, or I don't really know, is to what extent the EU actually has the capacity to do it. It certainly is part of these climate diplomacy action weeks. I mentioned all these fun events that they organize, and there they really try to do quite some public diplomacy to do exactly what you say, reach out to a number of other actors, not just governmental actors. But 1 week a year is probably not enough, and I'm not entirely sure. It probably depends on the country very much, but in most countries, that will not necessarily take place or not be a very strong effort just due to constraints in terms of capacity, human resources. But but I guess you meant also companies with certainly for energy, and I'm not entirely sure. I guess it's more of an energy than a climate question in a way. No?
Because you have some large companies that really have very strong and negative impact on the climate, so on the ecological situation. Probably you remember that the last year, it was, I think, exactly a year ago when the large Russian company, oil company, poured I don't know how many tons of oil to the river, and this is far north. So companies have to be really involved in this dialogue. They have, this is not just the economic question, this is much more beyond the economic question. So this is really about a climate, about the question of their work, how does it impacts the ecological situation and therefore the climate.
Yeah, no, indeed. So I agree with what you said, but what I rather meant is to what extent they really do what we call diplomatic outreach, or really, talk directly to a company that's based somewhere else, because there, I guess, depending on the country, but it could quickly become diplomatically a bit tricky because it could be perceived as circumventing the government and then not be well received by that government. So for that reason, I guess, certainly if these companies, if they're active on the EU market, then you have the other logic that I mentioned already earlier. I think the other, really going to a country, influencing a company directly, I don't know any example of that. I'm sure that some dialogues or some informal activities happen, but that's not necessarily part of this bigger strategy of official things to do. It probably would depend very much on the case. And that's why I thought that it would be a bit different for energy when we think about these pipelines and about kind of really investing in infrastructure, not just here, but also in those other countries. But maybe that then also would be broader than diplomacy, and you wouldn't necessarily label it diplomacy anymore. I'm not sure whether that entirely answers the question.
You did, but then there seems to be a gap in this diplomacy. That's what I tried to find out.
Yeah, but it links very much to sovereignty. And that probably also links to this carbon border adjustment. It is a very fine line, because we can't barge in to countries and tell companies what they should do, although the government maybe doesn't agree entirely with the with that position, or trying to to force a country or an actor into something that creates a lot of resistance, because then in the end it will probably, you will not achieve that goal that you're pursuing, which is climate ambition. So that I think it's a very delicate balance, where you then in the end do need a lot of dialogue before you use any of those stronger tools. Yeah.
Katja, you have a question in the chat, and there's somebody asking what the EU is doing, which steps the EU is doing on the way to COP26, if there's any G7, G20 or other things they are doing.
Yeah, I think now it's all a bit in the air, because there's no physical meetings. There was a very great plan that they had before Corona started, which was when we still thought that the COP in Glasgow would actually take place in 2020. So there were actually a number of key summits with China. So it was a whole plan of using those summits with China to really talk about climate. Back then, we also didn't know who was going to win the US election. So there it was really very crucial that we had the Chinese on board. So there was this whole plan to do that, obviously. as we all know, these summits didn't really take place, or only in a very slimmed down version online. So now I guess it's trying to continue what they had planned for last year, but still now these meetings don't necessarily take place. So we'll see. I think in theory, the plan certainly is there. I can't really tell you to what extent it will be implemented in the way it otherwise would have without the restrictions that we have. But the G7 is an interesting one where I guess you remember the one in Germany and I think the one in France, where climate was on the agenda, and where in the end there was a statement of all countries apart from the United States on climate, and where it certainly caused some discussions, I'm sure. You probably all saw this photo with, I think, Trump sitting, Merkel kind of leaning over him, and all the others around. So yes, that certainly is, I think, still part of the plan. And we'll see out. And then the UK is, of course, also investing quite some efforts in its diplomacy preparing. Of course, I know they're not part of the EU anymore, but I guess that's an issue where they're still closely, well, maybe not talking, but still aligned in terms of their position. And in the end, that's probably also good if the president is not from the EU, in the sense that the president needs to be impartial. Or, you know, if you're presiding over a negotiation, it's best if you need everyone's trust. You need to be perceived as someone who's benevolent to everyone. And with the French presidency and the EU, they also tried to separate the two a bit, so that the French were being perceived as the presidency as someone who wants everyone's benefit, and the EU of being a separate player pushing for its position. And I think with the UK, that's going to be similar.
Yeah. I myself have, if I may, two little remarks. One is, unfortunately, you couldn't listen to my presentation because we did some years ago a big study about perceptions and also interaction in EU energy and BICS bilateral policy, energy policy dialogues. And it came out that the EU delegation is always functioning in the role of a broker. So they were always the broker, you know, when they want to talk to each other. But then at the same time, there was a massive problem of knowledge management. There was an institutional loss of knowledge always, because they all shift every 5 to 7 years. And that caused, in the energy topics, caused a lot of problems. The question is, was that the same impression you had? Yeah. And one more, just more comment was that it came out that the problem in these dialogues was that the EU was not listening. They were talking to instead of talking with the people. And this is when you mentioned, EU is talking about climate change and sustainability, while the partner wanted to talk about investment or whatever. So there was always a problem in communication. How do we solve those ones? Because we want to push our norms through, but also we want to listen, or we should listen at least.
Yeah, indeed, we should listen, but we don't always do. And then, because we think we're so much better. Indeed, I think that what we found is very similar. So I did a number, I can't remember, 60 or 70 interviews with climate diplomats in delegations in 15, so the year of Paris. The delegation as a broker is not what I came across, but maybe it's because I asked really about the international negotiations. But
and energy is different because a lot of firms are asking, you know.
Yeah, indeed. So that might be a difference. But the knowledge, indeed, the continuity, that was something that came up. And also what we found is that often the diplomats who were more active were those who either came from the Commission or had some other climate background already, so had more knowledge. And, you know, it's not saying that the others don't do a good job, but indeed, you need the expertise, you need the knowledge, and you need to be committed. And if you just get the portfolio dumped on your table and you don't really care, then of course your own initiative will be much lower. And that's what we actually also found or what a number of people mentioned. And, I don't want to say it in a bad way. And some people just have more affinity with the topic and some others with another topic. But that can explain to some extent activity. And then, of course, yeah, they rotate. And then in an ideal case, we had some people who actually moved countries but stayed on the portfolio. And that was, of course, good, but it wasn't many. And yeah, the EU not listening, I think that really is, I mentioned it as a general lesson from Copenhagen. I think many things have improved, but it's a big bureaucracy. And I think that sometimes makes it very difficult, because in the end, these diplomats, they execute often the démarches or the things, the instructions they get from Brussels. And if the instruction is talk about climate change, then they talk about climate change. But one of the things which I assume could help, and which was part of the strategy, is these narratives. So indeed, really linking climate change to economic growth, to investment, to poverty, to all these other big topics, and really saying that they are compatible, there are synergies between them. What the EU often does is using its own example of saying you can decouple economic growth from emissions, and then shows its graph where emissions down, GDP up. Of course, you can criticize that, but so you linking the topics. But I think I fully agree with you that it probably doesn't always work or is executed to the extent that it should be. And but I really do think that it's partially because Brussels is far away, and the communication and the coordination isn't always that easy. And what I actually did hear from another number of people was that the communication or the information flow was much more from Brussels to the country than the other way around. And for the listening, you would need the other way around. And that might actually be one of the reasons for that.
Yeah, that was the same point with us too.
Ah. So you see, it's very similar in the end. Yeah, should do a comparative. Well, that's what Franziska does, actually.
Okay, I don't see any up. There's something coming in.
Yeah, I actually opened the chat now.
Can you read that? Energy
policy is more politicized and politically oriented compared to climate policy. I guess it depends. Depends on the country. So, from what country are you, Fred?
Are you asking where I work?
Or what country did you have in mind?
Well, generally speaking, by the way, hi. I mean that when it comes to the energy policy, it's very difficult to decouple politics from energy policy. In the case of where I locate and where I half come from, by the way, I come from two actually countries where I would say energy politics is very important, half from Finland, half from Iran. So it's not easy, when I'm talking about case of Finland, we're dealing with Russia, and, politics is inevitable, and also external, also when it comes to the Middle East and etc. Also, so I think in that sense it's very politicized somehow, one way or another, rather than climate policy. Because when it comes to the climate policy, you can depoliticize it to a large extent when dealing with external countries outside of the EU. But when it comes to energy policy, it's not easy. Just one comment regarding to previous, your first questions.
Yeah, good. I wasn't sure to what the previous question. Yeah, my question. You're good. No, but I wonder, because if you look at salience, yes, often energy is more salient than climate policy, and certainly in the countries you mentioned, and many of them. But I think in climate policy, at the stage at which we are now, people start realizing that this is really about changing our behavior, really fundamentally changing our economy. That it might not be as salient as energy issues, but it is becoming more polarized, and on a number of lines. And So on the social aspect, on some more economic aspects. So yeah, I think it's different, but I have the impression that climate is maybe reaching the stage or also becoming more polarized. But indeed, in terms of diplomacy, you're right. If a country doesn't want to talk about climate, then we probably don't talk about it. If it's really an energy issue, we cannot avoid it, and then it becomes very conflictive. Yeah. Now you know some very interesting countries in terms of energy.
Okay, so we have 3:05. Thank you, Katja, very much, and thanks everybody for joining in. We will be looking forward meeting you again tomorrow. Katja, you too, if you're
Statistics, energy.
I'm always invited to speak with energy people.
No, I wish I could, but I'm doing this statistics training.
Right.
Thanks a lot for being here. And we called that an outgoing keynote. And I think that it's a good format. Thank you very much, Katja.